The fluorescent lights of the Metropolitan County Clerk's office hummed with a low, aggressive frequency that always seemed to vibrate in the back of Elias Thorne's teeth. It was 2 a.m., the hour when the city felt less like a metropolis and more like a collection of breathing shadows. Elias sat hunched over his workstation, the blue light of the monitor washing the deep lines of his face in a sickly, digital pallor. On the screen, the spreadsheet of the jury pool for the Lindsay trial sat open. It was a list of names, ages, and addresses, the selected, the vetted, and the supposedly impartial. Elias rubbed his eyes, the grit of a 16-hour workday stinging his lids. As a defense investigator for high-profile criminal cases, his job was usually to find the cracks in the prosecution's armor. Tonight, however, his job was more administrative, a tedious final check to ensure the defense had nothing to complain about when the trial of the decade began. Julian Lindsay, a man whose wealth was as legendary as his alleged brutality, was not the kind of defendant who allowed for even the slightest procedural error. He clicked through the next row. Mary Sterling, age 34. Address, 442 West Oak. Elias paused. He'd been reviewing the background checks for the last 3 hours, and something about the Sterling entry felt off. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. He pulled up the secondary verification, the digital fingerprint scan attached to the jury summons. The software had flagged a low confidence match on the biometric data. Elias frowned. He tapped a key, refreshing the scan. The screen blinked. The facial recognition software had cross-referenced the juror's intake photo with the DMV database. The match was 84%. In the world of high-stakes litigation, 84% was a failure. A clerical error, Elias muttered to the empty office. His voice sounded raspy, unused. Someone missed a scan during the intake. He clicked the file again, opening the juror's digital dossier. He checked the social security number. It was valid. He checked the residential history. It was clean. He checked the criminal background check. No hits. Everything pointed to a perfectly ordinary, unremarkable woman named Mary Sterling. But the fingerprint? He pulled up the clerk's intake log. He scrolled through the timestamps of when the files had been processed by the court's administrative staff. The entries were routine: names, timestamps, digital signatures from the clerk on duty. He looked at the signature for the Sterling file. It belonged to a junior clerk named Madison, a man Elias had known for years. Madison was a creature of habit, a man who wouldn't dream of skipping a step unless he was physically unconscious. Elias felt a familiar cold prickle at the base of his neck. It was the sensation that preceded a major discovery, the feeling that the ground beneath a well-established fact was actually a thin layer of ice. He didn't close the file. Instead, he opened a separate window, one that had nothing to do with the court's database. He pulled up the municipal death records. His fingers danced over the keyboard, typing the name Mary Sterling into the search bar. He filtered by the local district and the last 10 years. The search results loaded slowly, the little spinning icon mocking his patience. Then, a single entry appeared. Sterling, Mary. Deceased. Date of death: October 14th, 2021. Cause: complications from a vehicular accident. Elias sat back, the ergonomic chair creaking beneath him. The silence of the office suddenly felt much heavier. He stared at the screen, the white text of the death certificate glaring at him like an accusation. "That's not possible," he whispered. He looked back at the jury pool spreadsheet. The juror currently seated in the jury box, the woman who had been vetted, sworn in, and photographed by the court's own security, was a dead woman. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that burned away the fatigue of the long night. He began to pull up the autopsy report for the deceased Mary Sterling. He scrolled through the grim details of the accident, the hospital records, the burial site. Everything was there. The death was real. The person who had died in 2021 was Mary Sterling, which meant the woman sitting in the courtroom, the one the court had officially sworn in, was an imposter. He looked at the intake photo for Juror 12. It was a standard, somewhat grainy mugshot used for identification. It showed a woman with dark, unassuming hair, and a neutral expression. It looked enough like the woman in the DMV records to pass a cursory glance. But under the scrutiny of the high-resolution monitor, the subtle discrepancies Elias had noticed earlier, the slight mismatch in the fingerprint, the differences in the facial scan, began to take on a new, more sinister shape. His mind raced through the implications. If a juror was using a dead person's identity, the entire trial was a house of cards. The prosecution would claim the defense was trying to manufacture a scandal. The defense would claim the court was incompetent. And the defendant, Julian Lindsay, could potentially walk free on a technicality, regardless of his guilt. Elias closed the death certificate and the autopsy report, but he didn't close the jury file. He couldn't stop thinking about the logistics. How do you slip a person into a jury pool? You don't just walk in off the street. You need access to the records. You need a way to bypass the biometric scans. You need a way to make a ghost appear as flesh and blood. He looked at the clerk's signature again. Madison. He thought about the clerk's office, the labyrinth of filing cabinets and digital servers. He thought about the high-profile nature of the Lindsay trial, the intense scrutiny from the media, and the sheer amount of pressure on every single person involved in the proceedings. Was it a simple case of identity theft? A way for a stranger to gain access to a high-security environment? Or was it something more deliberate, a way to plant a specific person in a position of power during the most important trial of the year? He felt a sudden, irrational urge to check the files of the other jurors. He began to scroll through the list, his eyes darting between the names and the digital signatures. He was looking for a pattern, a glitch, anything that might explain how a dead woman had managed to sit in a courtroom and take an oath. He worked for another hour, his heart thudding rhythmically against his ribs. He checked the backgrounds of the court clerks, the bailiffs, even the court reporters. He looked for any connection to the deceased Mary Sterling. There was nothing. No one in the court's orbit seemed to have known her, or even heard of her. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the blinds of the office, Elias reached a conclusion that felt both impossible and undeniable. The person sitting in the jury box was a fraud. He leaned back, staring at the flickering monitor. His mind was a whirlwind of legal strategies and investigative paths. He couldn't go to the prosecutor, Sarah Jenkins, with just a hunch. He needed more than a death certificate and a mismatched fingerprint. He needed to know who the woman in the chair really was, and more importantly, why she was there. He looked at the juror's photo one last time. The woman in the picture seemed to be staring back at him, her expression unreadable, her very existence a lie. He reached for his coat, his decision made. He wouldn't go to the authorities yet. He would go to the source. He would find out how a ghost had managed to walk into a courtroom and take a seat in the jury box. He stood up, the fatigue replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. He had a new objective. He had to find the truth behind the ghost in the courtroom. The morning light in the courtroom was far more unforgiving than the midnight shadows of the clerk's office. It stripped away the mystery of the dark, leaving only the stark, sterile reality of the legal proceedings. Elias sat in the back row of the gallery, his eyes fixed on the jury box. He hadn't slept much. The image of the death certificate burned behind his eyelids like a brand. He watched Juror 12. She sat with a posture that was almost too perfect, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood of the jury stand. She seemed like the very picture of civic duty, a quiet, unassuming woman who had been plucked from a life of obscurity to serve the state. But Elias couldn't unsee the discrepancy. He couldn't unsee the way the digital fingerprint had failed to match the woman whose name she carried. His mind kept looping back to the news reports he'd pulled up in the early hours of the morning. The death of the real Mary Sterling had been a tragedy, a sudden, violent end in a rain-slicked intersection. It was a closed case, a footnote in the city's long history of accidents. Yet, as he watched the imposter, the news reports felt less like history and more like a blueprint. He leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of her face through the gap between the spectators. He was looking for a slip, a moment of hesitation, a flicker of the person who had actually lived under that name. The trial was in a lull, a period of technical preparation before the prosecution's next witness was called. The courtroom was filled with the low murmur of lawyers conferring and the rhythmic shuffling of papers. Elias's gaze drifted from the juror to the back of the gallery. There, sitting near the heavy oak doors, was a man. He was a nondescript figure in a gray windbreaker, blending into the shadows of the doorway. He wasn't looking at the defendant. He wasn't looking at the lawyers. He was staring, with a singular, unblinking intensity, at the juror. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the courtroom's air conditioning. He looked back at the juror. She hadn't moved, but her eyes, those calm, neutral eyes, were no longer looking at the judge. They were fixed on the man in the gray windbreaker. It wasn't the look of a juror observing a spectator. It was the look of someone watching a person she knew and feared might disappear. Elias gripped the edge of his seat. He needed to know who that man was. He needed to know why the person in the jury box was watching him with such concentrated intensity. When the judge called for a brief recess, Elias didn't wait for the crowd to disperse. He slipped out of the gallery, moving through the throng of spectators with a practiced, unobtrusive stride. He navigated the side corridors of the courthouse, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found himself in the hallway leading toward the rear exits, the air here smelling of old floor wax and stagnant dust. He rounded a corner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man in the gray windbreaker before he vanished into the city. The hallway was empty. The man was gone. Elias felt a wave of frustration. He was losing the trail. He turned back toward the courtroom, but his feet slowed as he passed a small, glass-enclosed display case near the clerk's entrance. Inside, nestled on a velvet cushion, was a piece of evidence from an old archive case, a small silver locket tarnished by time. He stopped. His breath hitched. He recognized that locket, not from a crime scene, but from the grainy, digitized photo of the deceased Mary Sterling he had stared at hours ago. In the photo, the woman had been wearing the same silver filigree, the same delicate, twisted metal. A sudden, jarring realization struck him. The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a link. He moved closer to the glass, his forehead nearly touching the cold surface. If the locket belonged to the real Mary, then the connection between the juror and the death might be more than just a stolen identity. It might be something much more personal. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling slightly as he searched for the news archives again. He bypassed the recent reports and dove deeper into the older, more obscure files from the year of the accident. He searched for the locket. He searched for the name Sterling. He found a small, tucked-away article from a local community blog dated several years ago. It was a short, grieving piece about a local family devastated by a sudden loss. It mentioned two siblings who had been left behind. Elias scrolled down, his eyes scanning the text. The loss of Mary has left a void that no amount of time can fill. Her brother, Leo, has retreated from the public eye, while her younger sister has declined all requests for comment. Elias looked up from the screen. He looked back toward the courtroom doors. The pieces were beginning to shift. The identity theft wasn't random. Whoever the juror was, she had a connection to Mary Sterling. But the question remained, was the juror the unnamed sister? Was the man in the gallery Leo? And why had either of them gone to such extraordinary lengths to put Mary Sterling's name inside the Lindsay trial? He turned away from the display case, his mind racing. He had thought the mystery was about a fraud in the jury pool. Now, he realized the fraud was merely the shroud. The real mystery was the motive. He walked back toward the courtroom, his pace quickening. He had a new suspicion, a growing, heavy sense of dread. He wasn't just looking for a person anymore. He was looking for a motive that could turn a courtroom into a hunting ground. As he pushed open the heavy courtroom doors, the sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the chamber, sharp and final, like a shot in the dark. The trial was resuming, but for Elias, the real trial had only just begun. The courtroom was a vacuum of sound, the heavy silence of a midday recess pressing against the eardrums. Elias sat in the back row, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He felt like a man walking through a hall of mirrors, where every reflection was slightly distorted, every truth a mere suggestion. He couldn't stop thinking about the locket. The silver filigree, the tarnished detail. It was too specific to be a coincidence. He had seen that locket in the dead woman's photograph, and he had seen what appeared to be the same locket in the display case. But the locket in the case was an artifact, something old and preserved. The woman in the jury box was a living, breathing person using Mary Sterling's identity. How could a single piece of jewelry bridge the gap between a ghost and a juror? His mind raced back to the blog post he had found. Leo, a brother left behind. A younger sister who refused to speak. He pulled his phone from his pocket again, the screen's glow feeling strangely intrusive in the dim light of the hallway. He didn't search for the locket this time. He searched for the name Leo Sterling. The results were sparse, as expected. A few social media profiles, some disconnected email addresses, and a handful of mentions in local obituaries. But then, he found a news snippet from a much older archive, a small piece of a larger, more complicated puzzle. It was a report on a minor, unsolved theft from a local estate years prior. The thief had been described as a local drifter, someone with no known connection to the Sterling family. But the report mentioned a piece of stolen jewelry, a silver locket with intricate filigree. Elias felt a jolt of recognition. The locket wasn't just a family heirloom, it was a piece of a history he was only beginning to grasp. He leaned against the cold marble wall of the corridor, his breath coming in shallow, quick bursts. He hadn't discovered a new clue. He had merely found a new context for the one he already had. The locket wasn't just a link to the dead Mary. It was a link to a larger, older pattern of theft and disappearance. He thought about the juror, the way she had watched the man in the gray windbreaker. He thought about the man in the gray windbreaker who had watched her with such focused intensity. If the juror was Mary's sister, then the man in the gallery could be Leo. Perhaps he wasn't a hunter at all. Perhaps he was watching her because he knew exactly what she had done. Elias pushed off the wall, his legs feeling heavy. He needed to get back into the courtroom. He needed to see the juror's face again, not as a stranger, but as a piece of a much larger, more dangerous game. He walked back into the chamber, the heavy doors swinging shut with a muffled thud. The courtroom was beginning to fill again. The lawyers were back at their tables, the bailiffs were taking their positions, and the jury was being led back into the box. As the jurors filed in, Elias found himself staring at Juror 12. She was walking with the same composed, measured gait, her face a mask of calm. But as she took her seat, her eyes drifted, for a fraction of a second, toward the back of the gallery. She didn't look at the man in the gray windbreaker. She looked at the empty space where he had been. A flicker of something, fear, recognition, regret, passed over her features, so subtle that only someone who had been watching her as closely as Elias would have noticed. Elias sat back down, his heart thudding. The pieces were clicking into place, but the picture they were forming was more unsettling than he had imagined. The identity theft wasn't simply a way to bypass the system. The person in the jury box had deliberately resurrected Mary Sterling's name, and whatever reason she had for doing it was tied to the history Elias was only beginning to uncover. He watched the judge take the bench, the gavel striking the wood, with a sound that felt like a countdown. The trial was moving forward, the legal machinery grinding on, but the real movement was happening in the shadows, in the connections Elias was beginning to see between a dead woman, a silver locket, and a man in a gray windbreaker. He gripped his notepad, his pen poised over the blank page. He wasn't just investigating a fraud anymore. He was tracing a family history of loss and concealment. And as he looked at the juror, he realized with a sinking feeling that the person sitting in that box might not be the only ghost in the room. The courtroom was no longer a vacuum. It was a pressure cooker. The air itself felt heavy, charged with the weight of the truth that was about to be revealed. Elias sat in the back, his eyes locked on the juror. She wasn't looking at the empty space anymore. She was looking at him. The prosecutor stood, his voice booming through the chamber as he called the final witness, a detective whose investigation had uncovered a connection between Julian Lindsay and the deceased Mary Sterling. "Detective Miller," the prosecutor began, his tone deceptively light. You reviewed the records surrounding Mary Sterling's death as part of this investigation. Tell the jury, what was the most notable thing recovered from the wreckage of that car? The detective, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite, hesitated. He glanced at the judge, then at the jury box. His eyes lingered on Juror 12 for a heartbeat too long. The car was a mess, counselor. But it wasn't the impact that struck me. It was the passenger side. There was a piece of jewelry snagged in the seatbelt, a silver locket, filigree work. Very old. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the juror. She didn't flinch, she didn't blink, she simply sat there, a statue of civic duty, while the very evidence he had seen referenced in the archives was being laid bare in the light of day. "And did you recover that locket, detective?" the prosecutor pressed. "We did," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave. "But when we processed the scene, the locket was gone. It vanished before it could be logged into the permanent archive. We assumed it was a clerical error. We assumed it was just lost." Elias leaned forward, his mind working with a frantic, desperate clarity. The locket hadn't been lost. Someone had taken it. "But there is another thing," Miller continued, his gaze now fixed on the defendant. "We found a second item. A small handwritten note tucked into the glove box. It wasn't from the victim. It was addressed to someone named Leo. It said, 'The truth is in the silver. Don't let them take it again.'" The courtroom erupted into a low, confused murmur. Elias felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to move. The name Leo confirmed what he had begun to suspect. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Your Honor?" Elias called out, his voice cracking slightly. "If I may?" The judge looked up, eyes narrowed. "Mr. Stead. Thorne, this is not your moment to present evidence." "But there is a problem with the jury, Your Honor," Elias said, gesturing toward Juror 12. "That woman is not Mary Sterling. Mary Sterling died in 2021. The juror is using her identity." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The lawyers began to protest, and the bailiffs moved toward the gallery. The juror, the woman who had been so calm, so composed, slowly stood up. She didn't look like a criminal. She looked like someone who had finally reached the end of a very long, very exhausting race. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. The judge stared at her. "Ma'am, remain seated." But she didn't. "My sister died 5 years ago," she said. "Everyone called it an accident. Leo and I knew there was more to it. We just couldn't prove it." Elias looked at the defendant, Julian Lindsay, then back at the woman. "The Lindsay investigation brought her death back into the records," the juror continued. "For the first time in years, people were looking at what happened to Mary. I needed her name in this courtroom. I needed someone to ask why." "The locket," Elias said. Her eyes moved to him. "The locket was never stolen by a drifter," she said. "Leo took it after Mary died. He thought he was saving it." There was something hidden inside the filigree, a mark connected to people around Lindsay. Mary knew what it meant. That's why she wrote the note. The courtroom was paralyzed. The prosecutor was speechless, the judge was stunned, and the jury was staring at the woman in the box as if she were a ghost. "The man in the gallery," Elias said, "the one watching you." "That was Leo." The woman closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes. He was watching to make sure you didn't lose yourself in this." A tear slipped down her cheek. "He wanted me to stop," she said. "He told me this had gone too far." The truth, once so obscured by layers of identity and theft, was now laid bare. The juror, the real Mary's sister, had orchestrated the identity swap, not for personal gain, but to force Mary Sterling's forgotten death back into the public record during a trial connected to the people Mary had feared. The theft of the locket had been the catalyst, a desperate attempt by Leo to hold on to the one piece of evidence his sister had left behind. As the chaos of the courtroom reached its peak, Detective Miller stepped forward. He looked at the woman in the box, then at the empty space where the man in the gray windbreaker had once stood. "The man is gone, isn't he?" he asked softly. "He's always gone," the juror replied, her eyes welling with tears. That's what Leo does. He appears when he thinks I need him, and then he disappears. The trial would not simply continue, of course. There would be hearings, investigations, and a long, grueling process of untangling the legal mess. Julian Lindsay's case would have to survive the revelation that a juror had entered the trial under a dead woman's identity. The juror would face the consequences of her deception, and Mary Sterling's death would once again be examined in the public record. But as Elias walked out of the courthouse into the cool evening air, he knew that the truth had changed something fundamental. The locket would no longer be a forgotten piece of evidence. The man in the gray windbreaker was no longer an unexplained shadow, and the woman who had sat in the jury box under her dead sister's name would finally have to face the world as herself. He looked up at the city skyline, the lights flickering like the silver filigree of a lost heirloom. The mystery was solved, but the truth, he realized, was something much more complicated than a simple answer. It was a weight, a legacy, and a connection that even death could not truly sever.